Hey, this is four-time Black Belt World Champion Dominica Obelenite. If you guys are looking to level up your Jiu-Jitsu game with awesome Jiu-Jitsu courses on mindset, strategy, and beyond, make sure that you guys check out BJJ Mental Models Premium. I myself have a course up there, so make sure you guys check it out. Let's get you guys on that next step in your Jiu-Jitsu journey.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 238. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And today, happy to be joined by a first-timer to the podcast, Steph Gaudreau. Steph, how are you doing?
I'm wonderful. Thanks for having me. And I feel like I'm kind of fangirling just a little bit because I really love your podcast. So thank you for having me on.
Well, thanks. I greatly appreciate it. You actually landed in my referral network because we had some people asking for advice regarding women's health and women's nutrition for women over 40. Mm-hmm. I was told that you are the person to talk to about that. Yeah. And I found out actually that you're a fan of the podcast, which is awesome. So I thought, you know what? This is nutrition and performance in sport are never a dull topic here on the podcast. So I thought, you know what? You'd probably be a great guest to talk about this stuff. Yeah,
I'm honored. Thank you very much for that.
No worries. Well, why don't you go ahead and just give yourself a quick intro for people who might not be familiar with your work?
Yeah. So today is the 10th anniversary of me being self-employed and being an entrepreneur and working in the online space, which is a little bit crazy to think about. I was a high school teacher teaching science for 12 years prior to that. So it's been a decade. And currently, I'm really invested in helping women, especially over 40, to find their athletic potential and build muscle and get stronger and do all the cool stuff that we do. So that takes the form of sports nutrition. I'm a certified sports nutritionist from the ISSN and a women's coaching specialist, a weightlifting coach, strength coach. So that's kind of the different hats that I wear. And I'm really just so passionate about the intersection of training, of nutrition and recovery, and really just being able to show up our best, whether we're, getting on the mat, we're lifting weights, we're out for a hike or whatever it happens to be, and like really living these expansive lives because of what fitness can bring to us. So that's kind of the professional side of what I do. I'm also a brown belt out of Gracie Humaita in San Diego. So I've definitely had my share of hard knocks on the mat and learned a lot of hard lessons. And it's been interesting to apply what I know about nutrition and strength and that sort of stuff into my time on the mat and this aspect of my life.
Now, before we get into sport nutrition, I got to ask, what was the journey that led you to quitting your job and doing this full time? And the reason I ask is I am always fascinated in what leads people to make a career out of this. I think most people who are really into jiu-jitsu probably have this little fantasy at the back of their mind that one day they might be able to, do this for a living. But very few people actually do that, where they just pick up their bags and then they go. What was the journey to get to that point, to leave a more traditional career path and go into this and go into business for yourself?
Yeah, very windy and fraught with a lot of self-doubt and fear and the excitement of trying something new. But really, it kind of stemmed back to this transition that I had between endurance sports. So I was an endurance athlete for about 8 years prior to leaving that, going into strength training, lifting weights, CrossFit. And at that time in my life, I was starting to feel just really restless. I'd been teaching for maybe 9 or 10 years at that point and feeling like maybe I wasn't in the right spot. And through a performance psychologist, so sports psychologist who worked in the CrossFit field, her name is Dawn Fletcher. I did a coaching program with her, and she had us do this inventory of kind of our whole life and where we were feeling really satisfied and fulfilled and where we weren't. And I thought the big thing that was going to come out was my relationship, because at the time my relationship was really on kind of thin ice and about to end. And the thing that I actually ranked the lowest in terms of satisfaction was my career, which was a really big wake-up call to me. And I started to kind of get curious about what I could do. And at the time, I was food blogging and doing that on the side. And it eventually morphed into this idea of, what if I could turn this into something that I did full time? So I started off on the professional side doing more like recipe development. I wrote a cookbook, all that sort of stuff, and still was training at that time, I went to like CrossFit regionals here in Southern California and sort of, took small steps to eventually just make the break. And so what I had to do was ask my principal to sign this letter and send my petition to the board and ask for a year leave of absence. And it was terrifying because I thought, what if they say no? And I have to then decide whether I need to quit outright or go back. And what I eventually was granted was a year leave of absence, unpaid, of course, and kind of the blessing to go off and do whatever I wanted to do. And then if I needed to come back, I could. My old position would be there. And so that's what I did that first year. I really just tried to make the absolute most of it. And I thought, sink or swim, here we go. And that was 10 years ago.
Nice. So I'm guessing you never came back after that year of absence.
I didn't, but what I had to do was then write my letter of resignation.
Oh, that's always
for
tough.
real, So I had to then decide at the end of that year, was I formally going to separate from the district and leave my position for real? And I remember exactly where I was, what post office, and I remember the feeling of holding that letter over the letterbox and about to drop it in and thinking, am I about to make a really big mistake? And what's going to happen? Looking back, it's all worked out okay. But at the time, you had to take that leap of faith. And I think doing stuff in my spare time, part-time on the side, I did that for a while. And I was lucky enough to have that leave of absence to explore things. So it was definitely a path with, I think, a little bit more safety. But yeah, it's been a wild ride to entrepreneurship.
Sounds like it. Well, hey, let's talk about what's been going on for the last 10 years. You mentioned earlier when we were getting synced up at the beginning that your specialty is performance nutrition for regular people, really. And I love that thought. There's a whole library of resources you can go after if you want to talk about elite level performance nutrition and what to do if, you have a major world-class competition you need to prepare for. But that's a very different thing from, I think, the lived experience of the majority of our listeners who are going to be people who do this for fun. And for people like us, we're not necessarily looking to do things that are going to shock our body, like drop 30 pounds and then put it back on the day after for weight cutting purposes. Yeah. For many people who do this recreationally, we do this as part of a plan to live a good, healthy life. And nutrition is part of it. I am no longer of the age where I can just eat like garbage. I remember when I was 20, I used to be able to put anything I wanted into my stomach and I'd feel fine the next day. But, I'm over 40 now and man, like I have one beer and I feel like trash the next day. I have to be much more careful about what I put into my body. So I definitely want to hear your philosophy for this and how people like us can benefit from applying a degree of performance nutrition to their lives.
Yeah, I so appreciate that question. And I think that the role that I fill and the types of people I work with is really exciting because we get to help people kind of be better at the things that they love to do for fun or because it enriches their life, because it gives them a mental and physical challenge. And it just kind of helps them to stay active. It helps them to have community, whatever people are doing in terms of their pursuits. And of course, here, we have that really interesting mental, physical, emotional, community aspects to BJJ. So it's cool to be able to step on the mat and test yourself and see how you grow over time. I think exactly to your point, elite athletes and world-class competitors and Olympians and the people at the highest level, their needs aren't necessarily going to be different when we look at the broad brushstrokes. Of course, the specificity is going to matter because now we're talking about 1 point potentially making the difference between a championship and second place or a couple percentage points of performance improving, and that's going to mean the difference for that athlete. So I think where we get a little bit into trouble, though, is that folks who train with a purpose, train with intention, and show up on the mats think, I'm just not good enough to be considered an athlete. Or, I'm over 40 as well. I'm 44. So, I'm over 40 and my prime is past, and so I'm not an athlete. And I think we have a really interesting opportunity to redefine that for ourselves and lean into the idea that athletes come in all ages, shapes, sizes, proficiency levels, in their own sort of like the amount of time that they're spending. And it's really exciting to think, well, actually, I am a recreational athlete or I'm an elite athlete, and there's every spectrum in between. And if we lean into that as part of our identity, and this comes out of James Clear in his book, Atomic Habits, if you think about that model, yes, we know that habits or the systems that we partake in all the time are what are going to get us to our goals. But the missing piece for a lot of people is that identity piece. So what happens a lot is the disconnect is, even amongst the more recreational athletes, is thinking, well, it's not that important for me, or I don't need to pay attention to it because I'm not good enough. And in reality, if we can lean a little bit more into making some improvements in different aspects of our nutrition, our recovery, or thinking about our training in a more strategic way, then we do see those benefits and we are worthy of including that in what we're doing. So I think that that's the gap. And the exciting piece, as I said, is being able to like approach it with a different lens and say, yeah, I don't compete, and I will be the first to say I've done one in-house competition. So I'm more on a teaching track. And so I'm not a BJJ competitor, but I train hard and I love to get sweaty and challenge myself and do new things. And so we can go in there and train hard. It doesn't always mean that we're competing, but I'm better at what I do. I have more longevity. And I'm able to do those things because I think a little bit more about being strategic about what I eat and how I recover. And especially being over 40, we know that those things are even more important.
Yeah. And I love what you're expanding on there, where you're talking about this identity of an athlete and how many quote unquote regular people probably don't think of themselves that way. I know I certainly don't. I've never thought of myself as an athlete. And I've been confronted about that at times by people who say, look, you've been doing jiu-jitsu for this long, you run this podcast. How can you not claim that you're semi-pro at this? And I guess that's true to some extent, but I've certainly never identified as an athlete. And I think for a lot of people like me, that can be a very self-limiting belief. People might look at a performance nutritionist and think, oh, I don't need one of those. I'm not an athlete. I don't do this for, I'm not a professional, so I don't need a performance nutritionist. I'm just an accountant.
Yeah.
But I think that ignores how important nutrition is to all aspects of life and wellness. So I would love to explore that a little bit more and understand, what brings people to you? Is there a trigger point or a realization where these so-called non-athletes realize that actually maybe they're more athletic than they thought and they do need that assistance?
Yeah, ironically, it's usually because they're having issues in training. They're not feeling great on the mat. They're not feeling great in their strength training if they're doing that to supplement, rolling and things like that. Their energy is really low. They're just not feeling great. And I think that is ironic that a lot of times you're like, well, I'm really struggling in training. And again, that's where the disconnect comes in, is we might not be competing. So we might not be needing a competitive lens, I guess, if you will, on our nutrition. But again, like what we do, what we eat is going to have an impact on things like our energy levels, like our hydration and so on and so forth. And I'm sure we'll get into a lot of that stuff. But it's that realization that things are feeling different. And for most people, if you've been training long enough, you're going to have ups and downs, and not every day is going to be a 10 out of 10. Some days you're the hammer, some days you're the nail, right? We all know how that goes. But when things start to shift over a period of time, oftentimes people will come in, they've had mood disturbances, they're not sleeping, they're really sore all the time. They're just not recovering. They don't have the energy that they used to. Things are feeling a lot harder when they're rolling. They just don't have to get gassed out really easily. And it sort of becomes one of those moments where it's like, well, what is going on? And I have to say, I've been in a very similar situation where I noticed very similar things. I wasn't doing BJJ, but at the time I was doing CrossFit and weightlifting. And I got to a point where I was like, what is going on? Because I was having good results in training. Things were feeling great. I was feeling strong. I was making improvements. And then something changed, but my training is the same and what I'm eating is the same and all these other things are the same. So what is going on? And it really took me hiring a sports nutritionist. And this at the time is in 2012, to sit down with me and dig in there. And, was I going to go to the CrossFit games? Of course not. I'm not that caliber. I wasn't that caliber of CrossFit athlete, but I still felt like, athleticism is important to me. Being physically active is important to me. I have goals in the gym and I need to suss this out. So I eventually found help. And I think that it's hard as a person also who wants to be independent and figure things out on their own and likes to have trial and error, and you can treat things almost like you're a scientist. But at some point, you sometimes need that outside point of view, that more objective point of view to steer you and nudge you in a direction you might not even know you need to go in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things, nutrition, where results don't always materialize right away. And that can make it a little bit hard to be your own scientist, so to speak. The thing I always talk about in jiu-jitsu is that in jiu-jitsu, the feedback loop is really, really short. If you're in a sparring situation with someone and you try a technique and it doesn't work, you're going to know that right away. There's going to be no doubt that it didn't work. But with things like nutrition, you don't always see a benefit the next day. It's not like I'm going to introduce celery into my diet and then all of my health problems will be resolved tomorrow and I'll know, okay, well, that's exactly what did it. It's often a very long, complicated process to optimize your nutrition. And it is something that is hard to do. My brother has gone through this journey recently. He was having a whole bunch of health issues and he wound up ultimately attacking it by going through and doing an elimination diet and then gradually re-adding things. And he's in a much better state now. It's hard to do too because, everyone's body is so different. Just because something works for one person, it might not necessarily work for another person. I'd love to hear you just expand on that and how you kind of help people figure out how to attack the problems that they're trying to solve for.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first broad brushstroke is really having conversation with someone and kind of understanding that there are different ways that we might fuel ourselves, right? If we're fueling for performance or training on the mat, that might be slightly different from how we would fuel ourselves for, say, somebody's going through a fat loss phase or they want to become a bodybuilder and get into some aesthetic sport. There are going to be slightly different ways that we attack the problem depending on the goal. So first of all, what is your goal? I think that's really important. And it's something people often miss because there's so much nutrition information out there and we see just a lot of stuff. It's hard to even sit down and step back and assess what you're trying to do because, Bob in accounting is like, oh, I'm doing the newest, latest, greatest thing. And you're like, maybe I should do that too. He's getting good results, but he might not be training jiu-jitsu, right? So I think first of all, sitting down and having that conversation is super key. And then from there, we want to look at what do we know about sports nutrition priorities and what are the biggest rocks to move and what is the fine sand that maybe we don't address first. And then within that, there are going to be principles that we're looking at. And how exactly we customize those principles for the individual is going to depend on some different factors. So, how often you train, other sports that you're doing or other kinds of training you're doing on top of that. So for example, are you somebody that trains twice a day? Maybe you go for a run in the morning, you go to roll later on, or you do class and then after class you're going to lift later in the day, right? So taking that into consideration, taking into consideration the kind of job that you have, the mental bandwidth that you have for making changes, because on paper we can calculate the numbers and I always say your body is not a spreadsheet, but we need a place to start and we can crunch all those numbers and say, maybe outside of here, you have a job where you sit a lot, or maybe you're a day laborer and you're on a construction site all day, right? So we have to take into account some of those differences, even things like food preferences, dietary restrictions, and so on and so forth. So that's where we kind of move from those more general types of concepts, if you will, mental models of sports nutrition. And then we have to get in there and really kind of get into the weeds and help people customize this to their life, to their needs, and the other factors that are going on around outside of training that influence how they're going to eat, not just during, around their training session, but really in the rest of their day and in their routine, and how we help them to nudge and make changes in the routine. Because unless you have a personal chef or someone who does all the shopping for you, you still have to do things like grocery shop or at least do the Instacart order. You got to prepare the food, those sorts of things. So there's some finer detail that goes into it that I think really we have to sit down and look at the individual and their needs and their preferences.
That's interesting because one thing that I find again as I get older, it's not the getting old that's the problem. It's just all of the responsibilities I have to juggle. You know, when I was younger, it was not a big deal to go and hit the gym every day if I wanted to hit the gym every day. But now there's so many things pulling my attention all the time that it feels like time is my biggest enemy when it comes to sorting this stuff out. But I love your approach of attacking it almost from a mathematical standpoint. It sounds like one of the first things you do is try to make this data driven. How does that look? So if someone is in the process of trying to reevaluate their nutrition, what should they really be recording and looking at to get a baseline of what they should improve or change?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Because if you're going to make changes, you have to know what your starting point is. And if you do want to run more of a controlled experiment, if you want to use air quotes here, then we have to kind of know where are we starting and what are we going to change and what's going to give us the most bang for our buck. So I think for a lot of people is sitting down and either recording what they're eating for, let's say, a week. If they could go a little bit longer, the longer you go, the more kind of data you're going to get and you can look at the averages. But either taking a snapshot of what you're eating, there are lots of apps that you can actually do that and sort of put it aside and look at what's going on in terms of food on the plate. Of course, you could do stuff like track your macronutrients for a couple weeks, and see where you fall in terms of not just total calorie intake, but also the breakdown of protein, carbohydrates, and fats. And so getting a little bit of a clearer picture, because without that information, unless you have a really strong sense of like, I'm totally not eating enough protein, I know this, then it's going to be a little bit challenging to know what to tweak first. And again, looking at that sort of priority, our number one priority is to make sure we have an adequate energy intake to support the training and activity level that we have. And that also goes into things like our body size, right? Our age, our body size, our activity level. And that's going to sort of determine what our total daily energy expenditure really is and what our needs are. At least, again, using the calculation and knowing that we might have to adjust, but it gives us a starting point. So I would say if you're really not sure, is to start by logging what are you eating for a short period of time. It doesn't have to be forever. There are definitely ways that you can do this more with a visual plate method that you might see in something like precision nutrition. That's totally valid, especially if, for certain people, tracking calories or macronutrients or whatnot can be kind of triggering in terms of disordered eating or eating disorder. And so we want to be mindful of that too. But just getting a sense of where you're at. I have my clients do it really simply in sort of looking at these major categories like protein, carbohydrate, like a dense carbohydrate, vegetables or fiber, fat. And that's kind of a nice starting point for at least to get them to develop some awareness. But you can be really precise and log it all out. From there, I would also think about keeping track of your activity level, because some people, again, they're like, I was talking to a friend of mine this morning and he was talking about a study that was done where people overestimated their activity level during the day by like 300 minutes. It was a lot. So there, a lot of people think they're much more active physically than they are. Now, certainly you can tell what your training sessions are and log the time, but you want to maybe, for example, look at steps. Like, am I actually getting a decent amount of step activity in the day? So that can be a simple thing to look at. And I would say starting with those two things, because those are going to give you a starting point to at least either work with a nutritionist or registered dietitian and bring that data to them, or give yourself enough of a starting point to say, where do I really need to make some shifts and what is like the biggest priority? So again, that would be energy intake as number one. And then from there, looking at how we can adjust some of our macronutrients to at least get into a better range to support our training and our recovery.
Right. Makes a ton of sense. Absolutely. Something that I would want to get your feedback on is just energy levels. A problem that I've had, especially as I get older, is that I find it harder and harder to maintain high energy. I'm just exhausted most of the time. And that might just be the fact that I'm busy all the time and I'm working like crazy, but I'm sure there's things in my life that I probably could optimize for. I'm sure that a lot of listeners can relate, and whether it just be general energy levels or, of course, more applicably, on the mat cardio. Where do you start looking at there? What are some of the main culprits for why people might be struggling in that degree?
Yeah. First one that I see with the people I work with is inconsistent eating patterns, which lead to undereating, point blank. So just not getting enough calorie intake to support, again, your activity level. And it's so critical that sometimes we we kind of don't think about it. We think, oh, I must be eating enough, because in the world at large, we hear a lot of eat less, move more, eat less, move more. And especially as we get into midlife and we see lots of people around us maybe going on a diet or going on a weight loss journey or a fat loss period or something like that, we just kind of automatically internalize that. A lot of us do. Or we just get busy and we're like, wow, there went lunch. You know, I didn't get lunch because I was on a Zoom call and it went over. And so it's fairly common, at least with the folks I work with, to be just truly under eating and not getting enough food calories. So that's one place. I think the second place to look is sort of in your regular meals outside of, you know, any training window. And that's the necessity to eat before or after training is going to depend on a lot of factors, but just sort of your normal meals. Like, are these meals well-rounded? Do they have protein to, you know, keep you satiated? Do they have carbohydrates for energy? Do they have fiber to keep you full and bulk out your plate? They have healthy fats. And you'd be surprised how often we see things like, again, out of necessity often, but it's like, or habit, you know, all I can get is a protein bar, which again is going to have protein in it. If you can get a good one, maybe it has like 15 grams, which is still not very much, is going to be pretty low in calories. So sometimes we have that perception that I'm eating something, and so I ate. But in reality, again, you know, maybe it's lacking in certain things. Like, could be lacking in fiber, could be lacking in protein. It's just overall lacking in calories. You know, outside of kind of food, and it's obviously related, but hydration is so critical. And I think this is one place where folks often forget to really keep an eye on it. And I know a lot of my clients actually really struggle with this. In the 2018 ISSN position stand, so that's the International Society for Sports Nutrition, there's a quote in the paper and it says, the most important nutritional ergogenic aid for athletes is water. And it's, again, we think, well, I made sure I brought my water bottle with me to training, but we have to remember that hydration for what we're doing starts when we wake up. You know, it's what we did the day before, what we did the week prior, even in some cases. So that's another common one that I see with a lot of folks, is that they're underhydrated. They're dehydrated to some degree. So they might feel lethargic. They might feel spaced out. They might have difficulty concentrating or be kind of low energy and feel like maybe it is a food thing when it's actually a hydration piece. Beyond that, you know, obviously sleep. I work with a lot of women in perimenopause and postmenopause. And so that can just be really tough. And just in general, as we age, our sleep cycles can be disrupted and shortened, and we might become a more light sleeper. So that can obviously play a role too. And I mention that because sleep is such a crucial part of recovery. And we just oftentimes cannot get away with as much as we did when we were younger, in terms of like, oh, I'll just push it and stay up super late. And there's some really interesting research on things like how consistent our sleep is as being really important. So do we have roughly the same sleep and wake time even, and how that can be really critical for how we feel?
I want to dig into that for sure, because sleep has been something I've struggled with my whole life. I am always just so jealous of people who can just put their head on the pillow and they're out in minutes. I mean, for me, it's never that simple. I would want to know if you have any pointers or advice on that. I mean, I think everyone is going to know and agree that sleep is important to your health, but sometimes that is a little bit hard to really optimize for if you battle with insomnia, for example.
Yep.
What do you suggest that people do just in terms of good sleep hygiene and improving the quality of their sleep and the likelihood of actually getting to sleep if there's someone like me who struggles with it?
Yeah, and I super appreciate that distinction. And I work with a lot of people like yourself who have sleep challenges. And it's not so simple as just saying, well, just get more sleep, you know, because there's something that could be preventing you from getting a lot of rest. So it's not as simple as just saying, just go to bed earlier. So that sleep hygiene piece is so crucial. And, you know, doing what you can to give yourself the best possible chance. The biggest, I'm not a hacks person, but I learned this years ago and it has helped me so much. And I want to share it with your listeners because it might resonate. So we have this revenge bedtime procrastination.
Oh, this ought to be good.
A cultural phenomenon, right? Which is sort of, we have less time for ourselves. We're working more hours than we ever have before. If you have kids or you're caretaking, your job is really stressful, right? You're also training. You just feel like you don't have time for you. And where does most of that time for people occur where they actually do have a minute to just kind of like exhale and like do their own thing is at night. And so revenge bedtime procrastination is the concept that we're just going to stay up late because like, damn it, this is our time. You know, it's like the Goonies, like this our time. It's our time. And we're going to stay up late if we want to, because we're adults and we can do what we want. And the tricky part for a lot of people that like to read or watch TV at night or something of that effect is the cliffhangers. Mm-hmm. Is you read, there's a cliffhanger at the end of every chapter. If you watch a show, Netflix is on demand. You can just watch the next one and there's going to be a cliffhanger. You know it. So one of the favorite strategies that I've learned, and I use this myself, is you do not end the chapter at the end of the chapter and expect you're going to go to bed and put the book down. You do not get to the end of the show and think you're going to stop watching. You actually stop watching in the middle of the episode or the middle of the chapter.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Because there's no there's no dopamine like, ooh, what's the payoff here? Like the cliffhanger, I got to find out what happens. And so sometimes people will say, well, I don't know how to actually make myself stop. Just set a timer on your phone. Set a timer on your phone. When the timer goes off, look at the episode. How long is it? Set a timer. And you'd be amazed at how like less interesting this is. Another kind of interesting hack is if you're somebody who likes to scroll social media, especially at night, and that's kind of your kryptonite, is to turn your phone into grayscale. It is far less enticing when there's no color. So that's another kind of just a little hack on the side. But I think, some other general sleep hygiene things, trying to establish a relatively consistent, like this is the time I'm going to get into my bed, even if I'm not able to fall asleep for a while. That can really be that cue. We do this with little kids, right? Give them a bedtime routine. So whatever it is that you want to include in your bedtime routine, some really gentle yoga or stretching, yoga nidra, non-sleep deep rest, ASMR. I mean, these are like all things that you can kind of do to wind down your brain as well as your body and really give your body a chance to kind of decompress and get into that more parasympathetic state. One of the tricky parts is for people that are like, oh my gosh, I have to go to bed now. I got to get in bed right now. It's like your body's really amped up and you maybe haven't given yourself that time to kind of wind down a little bit. There's all sorts of other things, if you can get blackout curtains and try to block as much of the street light, especially if you live in an urban environment. If you live in the middle of the woods, maybe not as important, but a dark room, a cool space, a cool room. My husband is from Scotland and everything in San Diego is hot for him. So we got him a sleeping pad that kind of cools his side of the bed. And again, it's kind of an investment, but it really helps him fall asleep. Sleep masks, all these sorts of things, like they're little, but they can, for some people, add up to just kind of like a dark, quiet, cool space that's more conducive to sleep. Even if you are somebody who has, overall sleep challenges, is like, see where there's lower hanging fruit. I guess that's the thing I talk about with my clients. Is there some low hanging fruit here? Like, oh, did you forget to turn on your screen darkener on your phone or on your computer? You can still watch TV and do your thing, but see if you can dim the lights, those sorts of things. So you're not getting that bright light stimulation.
That's some really great advice. I also, well, first of all, I think you've inflicted some emotional damage on me here with that idea of a revenge bedtime, because that is absolutely me. That's absolutely me to a T. I mean, the challenge that I often have is that I'm just really busy during the day. And then finally, when I get the kid to bed, I'm just thinking to myself, this is my moment to actually get stuff done, right? This is the time when I can actually get work done, or maybe even this is the time when I can actually do what I want. And why shouldn't I be able to do what I want? I work hard, I deserve it, right? But next thing you know, you can wind up wasting a lot of time on that. So that is something that you do have to remain somewhat careful about.
Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, something that I also want to dig into here on the sleep front, the problem that I often have, and again, I'm just selfishly digging into this topic because it's very relevant to me, but a problem that I often have when it comes to sleep is, and you touched on this earlier, sleep can be kind of anxiety inducing sometimes. Because if it's not going well, if you're trying to sleep and you're not having success, it can get stressful and frustrating, and that can actually make it way, way harder to get to sleep. How do you deal with that kind of situation? Because that is just not easy to handle.
Yeah. So I think it's not something I struggle with super personally because I tend to be a fairly good sleeper, but my clients that tend to find that this is challenging for them. Some things that have helped them, if you're somebody who's more of a ruminator and you just have thoughts going on in your mind and you find that that's keeping you awake, or if you wake up in the night, you start thinking about those things, is to sort of do a brain dump and get all that stuff out. So I've had clients that will have a little journal by their bedside and they'll just like do a brain dump and write down all the things on their mind. If you can taper off on the mentally stimulating stuff like work, I know I have literally had dreams at night where I'm working in my head and it's just the worst night's sleep ever. So like working through work problems at night. So, maybe instead of working up until right before you sleep, you do some work and then do something for enjoyment or relaxation. I think if you are someone who wakes up in the night and you're just like, I cannot get back to sleep. I cannot get back to sleep. I know for a lot of people, just getting out of bed and doing something, going to a different place, if you have like a comfy sofa or something of that nature, and just sort of allowing yourself to get out of that environment. Maybe you're still like reclining or lying down and you find that that's like still relaxing. I know in the times where that does happen to me, I put on headphones and I'll like put on either music that I find is really relaxing or, like I said, ASMR videos or something like that. Yoga Nidra, which is like yogic sleep, basically. So there's things to sort of like take your mind off of it so that you're not just laying in bed staring at the ceiling, but also giving your brain something to focus on while giving you a chance to kind of calm yourself a little bit and not be in that like anxious loop of thoughts.
Yeah, that's great advice. That's great advice. It's a hard problem, but I mean, it is a very important problem. I know everyone, or at least a lot of people, struggle with it often.
Yeah.
Everyone struggles with it sometime, but yeah, I think that's great advice. So let's get into specifics here because, I mean, of course, the problem with nutrition is that it is a very personal thing. It is different for everybody in a lot of ways. There are some things that are going to be the same for all people, but generally speaking, when it comes to fixing health problems that you might encounter, it can vary from person to person in terms of what they need to do. I know it's hard to give general advice and to say you should do this, but I'm wondering if in your journey you've come across any general advice you can share, things that you just always recommend that maybe you're off the beaten path, things that people could listen to and they'd benefit from, and maybe they've never heard that suggestion before. Would love to explore that a little bit more.
Yeah, this is such a great question. And to your point, there's so much variability and so much that can be customized to the individual. And I never want to assume that what I think is sort of like, oh, everyone knows this is something that everyone knows. So I think, when we're looking at, again, considering our total energy needs for the day, we can go online, we can get a calculation to kind of start with. And that's a really good starting point to see, am I actually meeting my energy needs? And I'll say why this is surprising to people is because you oftentimes need a lot more energy than you've thought, right? Maybe you're on a diet before, or you just are like, oh, I'm not that active. But it's really important that we're taking that into consideration and sort of factoring in that activity level. So I know I keep coming back to that, but low energy availability and relative energy deficiency in sport is a really big problem, even amongst recreational exercisers. So that's really important. I think, one of the things that people oftentimes hear about is the recommended daily allowance for protein. And I think this is one that might surprise people. So we have kind of that basement, bottom level RDA for protein, which is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein a day. And there is pretty much, I won't say universal, but like there's pretty much consensus at this point that number should be higher, even for the sedentary population. That 0.8 is just extremely low. It is the amount to prevent deficiency. It's not the amount for thriving. And for athletic, active people, it is not enough to really prioritize things like muscle and tissue repair, right? So BJJ, we have a ton of stress on our ligaments and tendons. That's just comes with the territory. And so making sure that we have an adequate protein intake that is above the RDA. A lot of times people think, all I need is the RDA. Protein's not, we don't need as much as people say. But in terms of sports nutrition and looking at that, we're really looking at a higher range than a lot of people think. And so a general range for active people could be anywhere from 1.4 to 2.0 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. Again, there's going to be some variability. And I will say this too, another thing people don't realize is as we age, we need more protein, not less. We have anabolic resistance, which means it's just harder to build muscle. We start to be in a more muscle protein breakdown state, kind of seeing the balance tip. If we're a female and we're going to go through the menopause transition and lose the effect of estrogen in terms of muscle building, its effect on muscle satellite cells. So you ask for some specific populations. We really need to have the resistance training to stimulus to help our muscle grow, but also to give ourselves enough protein so that we stay in that muscle protein synthesis state. It's very, very, very important. And if we can, to spread our protein out throughout the day into, chunks, if you will. I'm not going to say like it has to be exactly between these numbers, but a general range could be something like 30 to 40 grams at a whack. And that will give us the best chance at our body saying, oh, I have this stimulus from protein, specifically the amino acid leucine, and I got to trigger muscle protein synthesis here. So those are some of the things regarding protein. I think the aging piece is very, very important. We think, oh, well, I just don't need as much. I don't need to eat as much. I'm, probably slowing down. Maybe my organ metabolism when I'm over 65 slows a little bit. Maybe I have the influence of hormones as I'm going through the menopause transition, and there's some stuff going on potentially metabolically there. But when they do studies on older individuals, they see that a higher protein amount is necessary to really keep that muscle mass, on people's frames to avoid things like clinical sarcopenia, of course, but we don't want to just avoid sarcopenia. We want to make sure we're able to thrive and have the benefit of, maintaining as much muscle mass as possible as we're aging, for a glucose sink, right? Muscle is such an incredible sink of glucose in the body for, just the ability to locomote and get around and do all the stuff we want to do and have fun and roll and all of those things. So I think on the protein front, those are some really interesting things that people don't always associate. Like protein is actually important for muscle. Muscle is an organ of longevity. It's not just for doing cool shit. Like, yeah, that is true, but having more of a longevity point of view as well is super important. I think I would also say timing is potentially one of those things that people think has to be very rigid. So like, do I need to eat before? Do I need to eat after? How much should I eat before? How much should I eat after? And a lot of that's going to be really variable for the individual. So I would say it's probably not something that a more casual participant will have to worry as much about. But if you are doing something like 2-a-days, or you are getting up and first thing in the morning, you're going to go do a really hard roll, it's going to be pohada, and you're going to go and it's like people want to like rip your head off, and you're just going super hard on the mats, or maybe you're going in your weightlifting first thing in the morning, then you may want to have a little bit of fuel on board. Those sorts of things, do matter to some degree. So it's not as rigid. People used to think, oh, the 30-minute window, after you train, if you don't eat anything, that window is going to slam shut. You've missed your opportunity. The likelihood is, the sooner we can get some nutrition on board, the better. But we have a little bit more of an open window. And I would say here, the tricky part is in planning, right? So if you roll at noon and then you're done by 1:30, and then you kind of get busy, maybe you go back home or you go to the office or something like that. And then it's like you don't eat until dinner time because you got sucked into that meeting. Now it's been potentially several hours. And again, just as we're aging, we don't have as much leeway with that. Like it's really important that we're recovering our tissues, of course, for everyone, but we really want to try to give ourselves some substrate to start replenishing the tank. And since BJJ is such an interesting sport, right? Sometimes it's aerobic, sometimes it's anaerobic. It requires a lot of strength, those sorts of things. Like it's such an all-encompassing sport, truly. We need to think about things like have a little bit of carbohydrate, put some protein in there so we can get our tissues repaired. That stuff is really important. So it's not as, I think, if you think about what people used to say about squatting, your knees should never go past your toes. We have some of those things in nutrition that kind of hang around, but it's probably more nuanced than that. And again, starting to look at those broad brushstrokes, I think is where we can get the most benefit.
Got it. Got it. Now, you touched on women's health and also health for people over 40 and the intersection there as well. This is something that is not explored nearly enough in the jiu-jitsu space. I think there is kind of an emerging body of instruction on how to train effectively when you're older. But of course, women in general are still significantly underrepresented in jiu-jitsu. Let's talk a little bit about performance and nutrition for women. Are there anything specifically that women need to be aware of or should be thinking about when it comes to their nutrition?
Yeah, I think one of the key parts, again, going back to protein intake. So women, especially those of us who are doing strength training and to complement our training, we may need an even higher, toward that higher end of the protein intake. And that surprises people because they think, well, I'm not that big. I mean, I'm a smaller person or I don't train that hard. So we might need closer to that 1.6, 1.8, 2.0 grams per kilogram of body weight because of the aging process, yes, but because of the loss of estrogen, we're losing one of those key signals for muscle synthesis, muscle protein synthesis. So we really need to make sure we're applying mechanical tension to our muscles, right? And then we also need the nutritional piece of that, which is providing our body with the right essential amino acids. We definitely need to think about bone health. Super, super important as we are going through that transition. And I will say too, for younger women, this is important as well. And for men, right? Osteopenia and osteoporosis are not specifically a female disease. It can occur in men as well, although women is a much higher incidence. So we want to make sure that we're eating enough, right? We need to have enough food energy coming in, making sure we're getting enough calcium. If you live in the Great North like yourself, or you're a person who lives here and doesn't get outside much, then making sure you're going in and getting your vitamin D tested and supplementing if necessary, right, for bone health and looking at that. And it kind of off of the nutritional aspect, but making sure you're including some power training or plyometric training as just a small complement to what you're doing so that you get that bone signal for those cells to really kick in and to get your bone to actually increase in strength and density. So that's really, really important too. I think with hydration, one of the really interesting things about hydration, and I'm not a hydration researcher, but one of the things that I do know through the work of people like Dr. Stacy Sims is that how, for example, hormonal fluctuations just in the menstrual cycle can affect premenopausal women. In the luteal phase, that's like the second phase of the menstrual cycle, we run a higher internal temperature.
Huh.
Yeah, right. So that's like a lot of people don't know that. And it's super interesting because it can make heat feel hotter in that second half of the cycle because we have a higher internal temperature. So really paying attention to things like hydration and making sure you're staying cool enough. And I know I've noticed in myself personally in the last couple of summers, it's San Diego, it's BJJ, it's the middle of summer, I'm wearing a gi, I am super, super hot. And I also notice when I have a harder time cooling down because of where I am in that part of the menstrual cycle. And as we progress through perimenopause and postmenopause, how our body is able to be aware, like how our body is able to sense our hydration needs can change. So we may not be as good at kind of getting those internal signals of, you need to drink now. And so it's important to also not just necessarily drink on a schedule because we can end up overdoing it. So we kind of have to pay attention to things like our hydration levels and know how we might need to change that depending where we are in terms of our different phases of life. So if we are in the luteal phase, we're still menstruating, for example, like paying attention to our hydration levels, especially if it gets really hot, really humid. And if we are going through the menopause transition, just sort of knowing that we may not necessarily be able to rely exclusively on thirst. And so making sure we're aware of that. So I would say those are some of the biggest ones that come up. The other one I see a lot though, and I'll just be quite honest, is in women who are in their 40s, going through the menopause transition or perhaps postmenopausal, is like a body image challenge for a lot of people and how that might intersect with their beliefs about how much they need to eat. And a lot of times I see a lot of women cutting out, just really cutting their carbs really, really, really low. And then again, the performance like on the mat, like having enough energy to roll, like can really diminish. So, of course, do we need to overdo it and eat a ton of sugar and all these things? Of course not. We need to think about those things as well. But making sure that we're getting enough of those like really great quality carbohydrate sources to fuel us. And it's just such a tough time for a lot of people. You know, your body's changing in ways you don't recognize. And to your point, I can count probably on I think there's maybe 3 of us that are over the age of 40, 41, 42. I think I'm the second oldest female at our academy. So I'm 44. It'll be interesting to see how, you know, we go through that population as we start to kind of get into our 40s or people, you know, below us. And then as we get into our 50s and 60s even, and see you know, how is that changing and what are our needs, and just the research that is needed to frankly catch up. We have such a huge sex data gap in terms of sports and performance, exercise science, nutrition, and those sorts of things. So it's kind of an exciting time to see where things go, but also just a time where I feel like people are kind of trying to figure it out as we go along, and kind of incorporate all these little nuggets of science as we get them, and just acknowledge that things can be different. And at the end of the day, some things are similar broad brushstrokes. Like we still need enough energy. We still have to look at protein. And those are just 2 examples.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Now, what about men, or for that matter, non-binary genders? Is there anything that you encounter in these demographics, things that maybe people don't know that they need to be focusing on nutrition-wise that they should start thinking about? Yeah,
and I super appreciate that question as well. And when it comes to men specifically, we kind of are going to pull back and look at some of those same principles that we talked about earlier. If we can envision this pyramid, and at the base of that pyramid for sports and performance really sits energy availability. Are we taking in an appropriate amount of energy for our body size to meet our basic bodily functions and cover our activity levels? Thinking, of course, here that on average, and this is going to be very individual, but on average, men tend to have larger body sizes and more muscle mass. And so therefore, overall, you may have higher needs for just overall energy, as well as if we look at, for example, our friend protein again, a higher absolute need for protein based on a larger body size and larger muscle mass. So of course that extends out to the carbohydrate need and fat intake as well. And then as another tangent there, if we think about things like our recommended daily allowances for vitamins, minerals, etc., men tend to have different recommended daily allowances as well. So for example, and this is just kind of hearkening back to what I talked about earlier with bone health in women, let's say you are a woman, you're 50, you're about to turn 51, your calcium needs daily will rise. And it goes from 1,000 milligrams a day to about 1,300 milligrams a day. For men of the same age, that calcium need stays about 1,000 milligrams a day until the age of 70, when at that point, the calcium need will rise to about 1,300 milligrams per day. So we have these slight differences in terms of recommended daily allowances of different vitamins, minerals, etc. And some of that is again down to body size. But of course, we know that men, for example, are producing testosterone at a greater level than women. And so we'll also have a need for things like making sure we're having enough dietary fat intake to support hormone production, including testosterone, zinc intake, and so on and so forth. So it's not to say that these things aren't important in women as well. They certainly are. However, we just want to consider that overall those needs tend to be slightly higher due to the, on average, slightly higher body size, and in some cases, if we're talking about muscle mass. We're also going to need to think about hydration. Of course, we talked about that earlier, but hydration, super, super important because men tend to have higher sweat rates compared to women. That means that, again, as we're coming upon summer here, paying extra attention to your hydration is critical, and potentially supplementing with something like electrolytes. Also knowing that hydration for your training session, if you're rolling, especially if it's at a hot time of the day, etc., is going to really start before the session itself. So we want to prevent dehydration, of course, which can impact performance and at a certain level be a real risk factor and a danger to your health. So taking that into consideration is really going to matter as well. And then just something to note on energy availability. So we used to only have the female athlete triad. This was introduced in 1992. and really looked at what happens when we have these three factors together in female athletes. And so those three factors were eating disorder, osteoporosis, and a cessation of the menstrual cycle, so amenorrhea. In 2014, the IOC released its first documentation on a new syndrome called RED-S. So that's relative energy deficiency in sport. And one of the reasons that RED-S is more comprehensive than female athlete triad is that it includes all athletes, so regardless of biological sex, and it goes beyond those three initial pillars, if you will, of the triad. And we know that now RED-S is far more encompassing and also includes things like hormonal disruptions, suppression of reproductive hormones in particular, psychological challenges, changes to metabolism, immune suppression, and so on. So this is, again, goes beyond just performance. There is a condition in males called exercise hypogonadal male condition. So it's sort of the parallel to the female athlete triad. But one of the things that came out in the recent update in 2018 to the paper on RED-S is saying that, hey, we actually do need more studies on endocrine changes, hormonal changes in males. And so we need to go further with this on what we understand. But just kind of on an extra note here, that in combat sports, of which Jiu-Jitsu is one, if somebody is competing, and even on a recreational level, they're, cutting weight quite a bit and trying to really drastically reduce their energy intake, either purposefully or sometimes accidentally because maybe training volume increases, that staying in low energy availability for a prolonged period of time can really have some of these negative outcomes. So I think for male grapplers, it's important to remember that if you are a larger bodied individual, your needs are going to be higher just based on the fact that you are a larger person. You're potentially sweating a lot more than some of your female counterparts, and you do have higher needs for a lot of these really fundamental nutritional components, right? Our macronutrients, our micronutrients, hydration, and so on. And you did ask about non-binary individuals, and I think this is a really important point to mention in this conversation, since even when we're talking about things like nutrition calculators that you can go online, what you'll notice is that pretty much the majority of them, as far as I've seen, are going to be based on a binary, a biological sex binary between male and female. And even a majority of the research in this area in terms of sports and performance nutrition, exercise science, etc. So there is still a very long way to go into making things inclusive in this way. And I think what I'll like to share here is just some very general points, knowing that if there is someone out there who is feeling challenged with how to adjust their nutrition, and particularly if, for example, they're on hormone replacement therapy or they're going to undergo a gender-affirming surgery, that it's really important to work with a registered dietitian or other professional who has specific experience in caring for individuals who have similar life experience. I think that that's really important, and mentioning that is important to the conversation. So to the best of my knowledge, to this point, there are no overall universal guidelines for trans or gender nonconforming people. And so that would mean that there are no specific sports nutrition guidelines either. Again, I could be completely wrong, but based on what I'm aware of, that there are no such guidelines to this up to this point. Hopefully that will change. However, it would, I'm sure, be useful to have some general broad brushstrokes. So the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics recommends and it generally advises to follow nutrition recommendations for a person's biological sex that was assigned at birth, regardless of their gender expression. And this is to help meet things like, again, overall energy needs, protein needs, and other nutrient needs. And, if we kind of go back to what we talked about with women athletes, this could mean paying attention to things like iron intake. It could mean paying attention to things like calcium intake, higher protein intake as we age, etc. If we think about, again, assigned biological males, that might mean needing more calories because of larger body size or larger muscle mass, and making sure that athletes stay out of a chronic low energy availability state. And along those lines, again, very important to mention that trans and non-binary athletes may limit food intake or specific macronutrients such as carbs in order to maintain a certain body size or body composition as a result of gender dysphoria. And also that trans and non-binary athletes are at an increased risk of disordered eating and eating disorders. So we really need to help these athletic folks keep an eye on their energy intake overall as a very important part of not just, again, performance, but of well-being. And I think the last piece I meant mention here is, for example, if somebody is undergoing gender-affirming hormone therapy, that therapy in and of itself may change a person's nutritional needs or potentially change their risk factors for certain health issues. So it's overall really important that anyone who's needing support and guidance on their nutrition seeks out help from a qualified professional.
Got it. Now, I got to ask you, a challenge that I always have when talking about the field of nutrition, for instance, is that there is just a lot of partially incorrect, or in some cases, fully incorrect info out there.
Yeah.
It can be very, very hard for a layperson to know if they're getting good information or not. Mm-hmm. And so I would want to pick your brain on that. And how do I know, as a hobbyist, someone who's not a nutritionist or an expert in the space, how can I really assess whether, if I'm going to a nutritionist and they're giving me advice that is actually based on good science? Is there a certification to look for, or some red flags that people should look out for that might signal bad advice? Just curious to know how you can help steer people to the best possible resources out there.
Yeah, I think when you're right, it's a minefield, right? We have everything from TikTok, nutrition fads, to people who have PhDs in research, right? So it's like spans the whole gamut. I think you can look for, first and foremost, like certain credentials or education to at least give you a general sense that this person has gone through some kind of process to test and assess whether or not they're knowledgeable. And I would say knowledge is one piece. So let's just kind of keep that in mind first. So if somebody's a registered dietitian, they are a nutritionist who has a credential from an organization like the International Society for Sports Nutrition, which is a pretty well-known organization of scientists who do this as primary research and then distill all their findings into things like position papers and conduct research of their own. Obviously, people who have advanced degrees or degrees in these fields and related fields. So that piece is important. And I would look for what are somebody's certifications, qualifications, and you should be able to find that relatively easily on their website, on their social media. And if not, ask them, what is your certification and background? And I think that's an important starting point. As I said, education is only one piece of the pie. And I think this is where real world experience is important. For example, if somebody is a coach, then you'd want to know that they worked with other similar people like yourself and were able to help those people get results. And I'm really interested in helping people get sustainable results, not just quick 6, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, and then it's like, boom, we're back to where we started. So looking for those, I guess, case studies or testimonials, or just, asking, hey, do you have any similar clients like me? How were you able to help them? Because there's one thing to have the book knowledge and another thing is to know how to work with people and help them with behavior change and shifting habits and again, all the other stuff that we know we're going to come into contact with. So I think that those are two kind of buckets, if you will, to kind of look for. And I'm not saying that there could not be somebody who is brand new and doesn't have a lot of client testimonials or case studies, or there's somebody who kind of took a non-traditional route who can't be qualified to be really good at what they're doing. But I think if you're just trying to sift through stuff online, that could be two things that you look for. Also, do they cite literature in the things that they talk about, or their articles? Do they provide references? again, it's not a fail safe, right? Because we know there's junky science out there. We know that there are just studies that are like rodent studies that don't really apply to humans, or it's hard to extrapolate the results to humans, those sorts of things. So just because there's a PMID, PubMed ID number attached to it doesn't mean it's exactly talking about what that person is referring to or that it's a good study. But if you can look for people that talk more about things like systematic reviews and meta-analyses, because those are really the top tier of their studies done on pools of studies that are high quality, we're more likely to have a conclusion that is potentially involving thousands of people, many, many studies. And so we get a stronger conclusion by pooling all of these studies together that are of high quality. So, does the person ever even refer to literature? Is it evidence-based? Can you, if they're talking about, say, I don't know, coaching, things having to do with coaching, can you find that stuff online? Is it like an evidence-based practice? Are they referring to literature? Are they at least including some of those things? I think that those are going to be those that require maybe a little bit more digging, but can really strengthen your ability to see who sort of knows what they're talking about. The other thing, and I'll say this is probably going to get me into trouble, but oh well, here we go.
Ooh, exciting.
If the person you're following only ever does hot takes and they don't speak in nuance ever, it's all like one way, or it's like there's only one way, I would question like how deep that person's knowledge is. Now, they might be someone who has a deep knowledge and is an expert and likes hot takes. I don't know. But I think if
an expert in hot takes,
like they could be an agitator, somebody who likes to get people's attention. They like to make bold claims. And I think that's okay. But if you can find no depth or substance behind that, because social media is, of course, all about the like capturing your attention in 3 seconds or less. So maybe their headline is very, eye-catching and you're like, oh, wait, what? It's got a hook and it pulls you in and you're like, oh, I don't agree with that. But then underneath it, they're able to provide that nuance and like have that discussion. That's different from somebody who's just walking around giving hot takes just for clicks. So I think you can tell a lot by the substance, the quality of what someone is saying. Are they able to speak in terms of nuance, or is it only just like, there's only one right way to do things? And, if you never do Bulgarian split squats, you're going to be weak, or I don't know, just like things people say, like this is the best glute exercise. I mean,
yeah,
there's a lot of variation there. So
yeah, I can totally relate. That's something that I have pointed out before in the podcast, which is that when people speak in absolute certainty, it's usually a sign that maybe they haven't done their homework. So that to me is one of the main red flags that the person that you're talking to might need to do a little bit more homework before they give advice.
Yeah, they're on the left side of the Dunning-Kruger graph.
Well, hey, Steph, thanks so much for coming by and explaining all of this. Before we tie up, I just wanted to ask, is there anything that you wanted to bring up which we didn't cover yet in this conversation?
Gosh, I think the only thing, and it's kind of a random thing that people ask me about a lot, is creatine. Or like,
you know what? I was going to ask that. Yeah, let's go off on creatine. Tell me what you think.
Creatine is having, for some reason, it's like having more of a moment now, but it's not something new. So creatine monohydrate is, a really, really well studied supplement. And for people are like, oh, I do this kind of sport. Oh, I do that kind of sport. Oh, like, I don't lift. Oh, I do lift. Like, is creatine beneficial? There's a whole bunch of myths about creatine. People think like it's only for meatheads and things like that. But truly, there's a lot of really interesting research. And I was just talking to Dr. Darren Kandow, who is a Canadian researcher on creatine. And he told me that there's now over 1,000 studies on creatine monohydrate. So really, really well studied. And they've done lots of like long-term studies at higher doses, and, in terms of adverse effects is, pretty nil. So if you're healthy, like it's generally considered pretty darn safe. And, if you are looking for a little bit of a performance benefit, you can certainly check it out. It's got some interesting research in terms of bone health and bone strength in postmenopausal women. There's interesting research into things like cognition, memory, the brain, right? Brain health, because the brain is a rich kind of pool. There's a rich pool of creatine in the brain. So neurological stuff. So it's just one of those things that people are like, oh, I don't know, like it's going to make me lose my hair or all these things, which is not true, or it's going to harm my kidneys, which again, we don't really have any robust evidence for it. It's been studied over and over and over again. And so then the next question I get from people is like, well, how do I take it? Generally speaking, most people don't need to load creatine very quickly. You just take a lower maintenance dose. And for most people, that's like 3 to 5 grams. And you just take it for about a month until your stores are topped up. And then you just take that dose daily and keep it going. So especially if you're somebody who doesn't eat a lot of animal protein, it could be even more beneficial because we do get some creatine from animal products, from meat and fish and things like that. But it's really hard it's basically impossible to eat enough animal protein to completely maximize your creatine stores. So yeah, it's an awesome supplement for so many people. I would highly recommend people check into it. Of course, I always say before you start taking any supplement, you have to run it by your doctor. Make sure you get their blessing. But yeah, it's really, really great one, especially for people who are aging. And, the research on that population is increasing as well. And now looking at some of the other neurological, brain, mood, depression, things like that. So, if you're curious, you want to know more about the literature, check out people like Dr. Darren Kandau, Dr. Scott Forbes, both in Canada and doing really cool stuff about creatine research. So check that out.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Steph. I really do appreciate it. If people want to follow you, contact you, work with you, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at Steph_Gaudreau. So just my name. I also have a podcast called the Fuel Your Strength Podcast, where we talk about a lot of these issues. So you can check that out. And my website, StephGaudreau.com.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much. As I always do, I'll put the links there in the show notes to make it easy for people to click through. So if you want to reach out to Steph, just go to your podcast player, hit info or description or notes or settings or whatever it says. And just you'll find the big write-up there with some links you can just click to get in contact with Steph. I'll also put a link to all of our stuff there. Everything we make is at bjjmentalmodels.com. That includes well over 200 episodes of the podcast now, all of which are free, as well as our newsletter, which is also an amazing resource, also free. If you do have some money you want to spend and you want to support us, I do recommend checking out BJJ Mental Models Premium. You can get that at the same site. That's our service where if you sign up, you're going to get access to our entire audio course library, as opposed to the podcast where we have these kind of one-off conversations. We go a lot more in depth with some of the best people in the sport. So I do recommend checking that out on Premium. You also get direct coaching from our amazing Premium review team. Features some of the best black belts practicing in the sport today, like Marco Ciccarelli, Brianna St. Marie, Josh McKinney. There's a ton on there. So that's an amazing value. And you also get access to our awesome Discord community, which I definitely recommend everyone be a part of. Again, that's all at bjjmentalmodels.com. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes too, as I always do. But Steph, thanks so much for coming by. This was a fun one. I always love talking about topics like this that are beneficial to the 99% of us who aren't world champions. So thank you so much for coming by and sharing this information.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. And thanks to the listeners too. Always appreciate you as well. We'll talk to you next time. See you soon.